The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers.
Hello, everyone.
So, tonight we decided to skip the housekeeping. So with that said, sit back, get comfortable, and let's see where Beth's mind wandered this week.
So, here's something that's freaked me out since I was a kid. Spontaneous human combustion. I don't have any memory of when I first heard about it, but I'm guessing it was on the school bus, and it terrified me. A person can just burst into flames and become a pile of ash without warning. Nothing around them would even be singed. No one could really tell me how it could happen, so my mind ran wild. Maybe, I thought, if you think too hard, you combust. Or maybe if you get really mad, you combust. Or worse still, maybe you don't have to be doing anything at all and you could spontaneously combust. It was truly terrifying to me until somebody, probably my mom or dad, rationally asked me, "Have you ever heard of it happening to anyone you know?" Well, no. Then it's not something you need to worry about. Over the years, I accepted that spontaneous human combustion was nothing more than a silly myth, an urban legend, because, frankly, my mom or dad was right. No one I have ever known has ever had it happen to anyone they know. And if there were cases of it that popped up here or there in various places, there had to be a rational explanation. It can't be a real thing, can it? Well, on Christmas Eve, 1985, in Seneca, Illinois, Matilda Rooney was alone in her kitchen when, somehow, she caught on fire. The fire burned so hot that all that was left of her body were her feet. Investigators were totally baffled because nothing else in the kitchen was burned or even singed. There was no sign of any sort of accelerant or fire source. There was no evidence whatsoever of foul play. A year later, in 1986, 58-year-old retired firefighter George Mott was found in his apartment in Crown Point, New York. Not that far from us.
Not that far at all.
The scene was eerily similar to Rooney's. There was no sign of foul play, no sign of any external fire source, and everything around Mott was perfectly fine, not a single speck of fire damage. And yet, Mott was reduced to a pile of ash. The only bones investigators found were one leg, a few rib bones, and his shrunken head. Now, as gory as that is, remember the shrunken head part because it's going to come up again later. Believe it or not, SHC is not a modern phenomenon. There are records of it happening in the 17th century, but it showed up in popular literature as far back as novels written by Herman Melville and Charles Dickens. They even killed off some of their characters that way. But in the case of popular literature, the characters killed off by SHC were often gluttonous and drank too much. and they were killed off that way as a lesson to readers to eat and drink in moderation. But readers began to believe that SHC was totally possible because, they reasoned, both fat and alcohol were flammable. So what may have started out as just a fanciful writing trope turned into an actual belief. What's interesting, though, is that Dickens himself believed it was possible to spontaneously combust, and when critics questioned him, he would cite doctors who agreed with him. According to Britannica, spontaneous human combustion absolutely does not happen. So, if you're worried that one day you'll be sitting in your favorite chair, listening to your favorite podcast, and you could burst into flames, stop worrying. According to Britannica, all of the theories about how spontaneous combustion could happen have been totally debunked. For example, at first, people proposed that SHC could happen if your bodily humors were out of whack. Victorians thought SHC could happen if a person consumed too much alcohol, thanks to Charles Dickens and Herman Melville. Since alcohol is flammable, it could ignite somehow internally. Doctors have proven that even if a person has enough alcohol in their system to cause their body to have accelerated flammability, it would still take an external flame. Fast forward another century, Britannica explains, and experts debunked SHC with something called the wick effect. Although gruesome, it's quite simple. Picture a wax candle in a glass container. Once you light the wick, it burns, melting the wax around it into a molten pool, contained within the glass. Once the wick is completely gone, the flame goes out. The pooled wax remains hot for quite a while after, but it too is still contained inside the glass. Now, think of a person sitting in a chair. They are incapacitated in some way, either from drinking or taking sleeping medication. Maybe they're having a cigarette, and as they fall asleep, ash falls into their lap. Certain clothing fabrics, when set on fire, actually burn very slowly and kind of adhere themselves to body fat as they smolder. So now you have the container, the person, the wick, the clothing and fat, and the flame, the cigarette. Supporters of the theory point out that in the absence of highly flammable clothing, a person's hair could be the wick. They also point out that in most cases of SHC, this is the most likely explanation, because in this scenario, the fire doesn't spread beyond the person themselves. It's an interesting theory, but it doesn't explain everything. For example, human bodies are mostly made of water, which isn't a very easy thing to burn. So, does the wick effect really happen? According to livescience.com, experimental results vary. One attempt by Parascience International investigator Larry Arnold failed. He'd wrapped a ham hock in a blanket and lit it on fire, but it didn't do what it was supposed to do. But QED, a BBC TV show, did the same experiment. They used a whole pig, and the pig did undergo a slow burn for several hours without setting anything else around it on fire. So, does that prove it? Not really, because the thing is, there have been about 200 documented cases of spontaneous human combustion in the last 100 years worldwide, and there are some that just don't follow the expectations of the wick effect, like Mary Reeser. It was July 1st, 1951, and 67-year-old Mary Reeser had spent the evening with her son in her home in St. Petersburg, Florida. Her son later said that when he left, Mary was wearing a rayon nightgown, a robe, and slippers. She had taken a sleeping pill and was sitting up in her favorite chair. The following morning, Pansy Carpenter, who was Mary's landlord, stopped by to deliver a telegram. Pansy told police that she was concerned that Mary wasn't answering her door, and as soon as she touched the doorknob, she panicked because it was hot. When first responders entered the apartment, they noted that it was overly warm, even though several windows were open. And where Mary's chair had been, well, it was now completely burned, and so was the nearby lamp. At first, they assumed Mary was still in the house somewhere, until they made the horrible discovery that Mary's remains were in her burnt chair. She was completely cremated, except for her left foot, which was still wearing a slipper, a few rib bones, and, like George Mott, her shrunken skull. A nearby clock's plug was melted into the socket and had stopped at 4:20 a.m. There was some soot on the ceiling directly over her chair, but the rest of the room, including her bed just a few feet away, were in perfect, pristine condition. After a month of investigation, police still couldn't figure it out. It would have taken a continued temperature of 3,000 degrees over several hours for Mary to be cremated. How could a fire that hot burn for that long and not spread beyond her chair? It didn't help that the police station received numerous tips from people who said things like, quote, "A ball of fire came through the open window and hit her. I seen it happen," end quote. Others offered tips like she had been napalmed. Police Chief J.R. Reichert released a statement saying it was the most unusual case he'd ever seen, and he contacted the FBI for help. The FBI went with the wick effect, saying since Mary was a known smoker, she had accidentally dropped ash on herself. Because she had taken a sleeping pill, she likely died of smoke inhalation. Her rayon nightgown had burned slowly, and because she weighed 170 pounds, the fire had burnt itself out once it had consumed her body fat. Mary's son and daughter-in-law agreed with the FBI's conclusion. But not Dr. Wilton Krogman, a physical anthropologist who Reichert called in as a consultant on the case. Krogman said, quote, "I find it hard to believe that a human body, once ignited, will literally consume itself, burn itself out, as does a candle wick. Never have I seen a body so completely consumed by heat. This is contrary to normal experience, and I regard it as the most amazing thing I have ever seen. As I review it, the short hairs on my neck bristle with vague fear. Were I living in the Middle Ages, I'd mutter something about black magic," end quote. And the biggest question of all, posed by Krogman, was how a fire of such magnitude could have left the rest of her apartment unscathed, and how it shrank Mary's skull to the size of a teacup. He pointed out that a fire that hot should have caused her skull to crack or even explode, but definitely not shrink it to such a tiny size. But apparently, like I mentioned earlier, George Mott had had the same thing happen to his skull. So, to continue with more cases in which SHC doesn't seem to fit the wick effect, there are two in which the victims survived. In 1974, door-to-door clothes salesman Jack Angel parked his RV in the Ramada Inn parking lot in Savannah, Georgia. 66-year-old Jack decided to take a nap, and when he woke up, he felt this terrible burning sensation all over his body. Although his bed and pajamas were completely intact and showed no signs of fire, Jack had blistering burns on his arms, legs, and back, and what he described as an actual burn hole in his chest. He tried to get to the hotel phone to call for help, but collapsed as soon as he stepped into the lobby. He woke up in the hospital to puzzled doctors who said, as far as they could tell, the burning had originated from inside his left arm or hand. His arm was now so infected that he had to have it amputated. Jack didn't accept the spontaneous human combustion explanation because he wasn't a smoker and absolutely nothing else was burnt except his own body. Convinced that the RV had some sort of faulty wiring, Jack sued the company. Independent experts came out and confirmed that there was absolutely no way that the RV had caused the extensive burns, and Jack lost his lawsuit. And then there's Frank Baker, a decorated Vietnam War veteran from Vermont. Baker was sitting on a couch with a buddy when both of them claim Frank literally burst into flames. His friend doused him with water and brought him to the ER. Doctors told him that he, too, seemed to have burned from the inside out. So, what the heck is going on? Do I need to start worrying about spontaneous human combustion again like I did when I was 7 or 8 years old? Probably not. The phenomenon, if it really isn't the Wick effect, is extremely rare. And if it is the Wick effect, it's still, thankfully, extremely rare.
I've always found it intriguing. When I was growing up, I remember hearing cases about this, seeing the pictures. And then after a while, as I got a little older, knowing more about the human body, I think it's perhaps just some perfect storm of the chemical imbalance going on in your body. I think that's exactly what it is. That's why it's so rare.
Well, there was one research paper that I came across. I didn't include it, but there was a doctor who was saying that he thought that people who are ill release a certain type of gas, and that spontaneous human combustion could be because of the amount of this gas that ill people, I can't remember what it was, the specific gas. But then I was thinking, the reason I didn't include it was because in most of these cases, the people hadn't claimed to be ill beforehand. But it's interesting that you brought that up, that it could be a perfect storm of stuff.
It could very well be. I mean, the Wick effect does explain some things. But
why the shrunken heads? I mean, I looked that up too. It does make sense that they would crack or explode, not shrink in.
Right. And here's the thing, nothing's ever burnt around them. It's just contained to that one specific area, which is totally odd.
Really weird.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if any of you out there have ever seen the pictures of spontaneous human combustion, but it's pretty gnarly. If it's something you haven't checked out, you should go and look.
But then don't worry about it all the time like I probably will. Hey, did you know? American presidents used to hold inauguration parties in the White House, open to the public with free refreshments. Anyone could come and meet the new commander-in-chief. The party for Andrew Jackson on March 4th, 1829, turned into a full-blown rager. Rowdy people knocked over furniture, spilled wine on the floors, shoved White House staff, and searched off-limit rooms. Desperate to lure the party-hardy rabble outdoors, the resourceful staff put massive tubs of free whiskey out on the White House lawn. It reportedly took months for them to get the smell of cheese out of the White House carpets. Who'da thunk it? So, Wes, where did your mind wander off to?
Well, like many other people, I love old train stations, from the architecture to the history that goes with them. I can imagine the joy of a loved one coming in and the heartbreak of a loved one leaving. All the interesting people embarking on their travels to familiar and unknown destinations. I just find them so fascinating. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about a train station. And as far as train stations go, this one is absolutely gorgeous. Built in 1915, its symmetrical neoclassic red brick facade has 12 pristine white ionic columns. Inside, the main hall has 2 clocks, one on the east wall and one on the west, and there are 12 ionic columns as well. The ceiling is covered in recessed panels, painted a delicate peach, and there are landscapes dotting the walls. The station still bustles with travelers on a daily basis, but as the evening hours close in and the weary travelers thin out, security guards and custodians, as well as office employees, might see the beautiful station a little differently. They report phantom footsteps, disembodied music, objects moving on their own, and several apparitions, including a 1920s flapper girl and a railroad worker who met an unfortunate end. This week, I'm talking about the allegedly haunted Waterfront train station in Vancouver, Canada. Waterfront Station was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1914, connecting Vancouver to Montreal and Toronto. It was originally named the Canadian Pacific Railway Station, and it was a grand station. It was built by Montreal architects Barreau Blackadder and Webster, for when train travel was considered a special and exciting event. Filled with columns and arches, the west side of the building contained restaurants and a dance hall. The east side provided full-time residences and lodging for weary travelers. The murals throughout the building depict scenes a passenger would see as they traveled along the scenic train routes. In 1922, a bronze sculpture of the Angel of Victory was added outside the station to memorialize the 1,100 Canadian Pacific Railroad employees who perished in World War I. A plaque was added in the 1940s to include those who died in World War II. In the 1970s, the traditional train tracks were removed, and Waterfront Station welcomed the Sea Bus, which is a passenger ferry. And in the 1980s, they added the Sky Train Expo line, which is a rapid transit line. The residences were converted into office space and storage rooms by that time also. But even though the station was no longer used in exactly the same way it was almost 70 years ago, there were still some passengers or former residents who decided to stick around, at least in spirit. Security guards and employees certainly believe so, especially during the hours between 1:30 a.m. and 6 a.m., when there are no trains running in or out of the station. There are several stories about the ghost at the station, with most of them taking on the tinge of legend. Now, I say that because I couldn't find any first-person accounts or specific names of people involved for most of them. But when the Canadian government commemorates one of the alleged ghosts with a postage stamp, well, the haunting reaches a certain status. At least I think so. Apparently, it's a common occurrence to hear 1920s-era jazz music softly wafting through the station at night, even though security guards can't locate a source. One night, as this jazz music was playing, a security guard decided to hunt down where exactly the music was coming from. As he crossed into the west side of the station and passed a corridor, the music got louder, as if a roaring party was underway. He entered the former ballroom, only to be hit with the overwhelming sense that he had walked into an actual party, even though the room was completely empty, or mostly empty. He could clearly see a young woman in a red 1920s flapper-style dress in one corner of the room, dancing by herself to the music. As he stepped closer to see who she was and why she was in the building, the music abruptly stopped, and the young woman just evaporated. She just vanished. Now remember, the west side of the building once had a dance hall reserved for Vancouver's elite to hold lavish parties and balls. So, was she a former guest, reliving one of her best nights, or one of her worst? Another security guard had a somewhat frightening experience one night while he was on patrol. As he entered a room in the northwest corner of the station, he came face to face with an elderly woman. According to Ghost of Vancouver, this woman looked incredibly sad, and she also glowed an almost phosphorus white. Terrified and unable to move, the guard only stared at her until she reached out towards him. Suddenly, able to move, the guard hightailed it out of the room. There was also another guard that had what might have been an even more frightening experience in the eastern side of the building. While patrolling the second floor, which is used for office space and storage, he entered a room filled with old desks that were obviously being stored away. As he moved further into the room, he heard an unnerving sound behind him, like furniture being moved. When he turned around, he was both puzzled by and terrified to see that the clear path to the door was now blocked by several of the desks. He was so scared that he actually scrambled over the desk as fast as he could to get out of the door. But the creepiest tale by far is the old woman in the kitchen. Maybe she's the same woman the previous guard saw in the northwest corner, or maybe she's a completely different entity, but she certainly seemed to have something to say. As I mentioned earlier, there were once several restaurants in the Waterfront station, and one evening, a guard found himself in an old basement kitchen that wasn't used anymore. He also came face to face with the apparition of an elderly lady. She stared at him with an intense look on her face, but instead of just reaching out for him, she seemed to float towards him. Freaking out the guard ran from the room. The story continues that after that night, the guard seemed to see her face everywhere, peering at him through random windows and staring back at him in numerous mirrors. As if that wasn't bad enough, her face began showing up in his dreams also. Now, this guard was not an artist, but during his waking hours, he felt incredibly compelled to paint her portrait, so he did. Not sure what to do with the portrait once it was done, or maybe he just wanted to get it out of his house, he brought it to the old kitchen and left it there. And for whatever reason, that seemed to appease her. He never saw her apparition again. But her tale is so well known that new people who are hired as guards are allegedly brought down to the kitchen to say hello to the portrait in a show of respect. Now, I can imagine that close to 1 million travelers have passed through the Waterfront station. 72,000 people used the station in 2016 alone. And we know that during the 3 decades between the 1920s and the 1950s, there were people who stayed there for extended periods of time. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of station employees over the years, from ticket masters to engineers to maintenance workers. So, it really shouldn't come as any surprise that another common occurrence at the station is the sound of rushing footsteps on the floors, even though there was no one visibly around. According to Haunted Canada 6, Most Terrifying True Stories by Joel A. Sutherland, between 2004 and 2005, a guard heard phantom footsteps in a stairwell on 3 separate occasions. The first time it happened, the footsteps approached him so quickly and unexpectedly that the guard barely had time to think before the sound rushed past by him within 2 feet. The second time, he stood still and watched as the footsteps approached at a run and passed by him. The third time, he had a colleague with him, and both of them heard the running footsteps approach and then pass by them. Now, in case these weren't enough for you, there's more. The apparitions and strange noises don't just stay in the storage spaces of the eastern side of the building. There are reports that the offices on that side of the building also have some paranormal activity of their own. Remember, this is where the residences once were. This next encounter also comes from Haunted Canada 6. One day, a senior account executive named Deborah Loomis and a colleague were in the washroom. As they talked, a third woman joined them. Neither woman recognized her. She had long, wavy brown hair and wore a blue blouse that looked out of place. This stranger stood silently with the other 2 women, not saying anything. Then she said, "I'll come back another time." Neither Deborah or her colleague saw or heard the woman leave. If we go back into the Waterfront station waiting area, there is yet another strange sight that many people have claimed to see. In fact, they seem to see these apparitions quite frequently. I say these because there are 3 of them. Several employees have caught sight of the apparition of 3 little old ladies sitting next to each other on a bench as though they are waiting for a train. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't able to find any first-person accounts for any of these alleged sightings. In fact, all the sources I found repeated the same stories with very little added detail. So with that said, I do have to wonder if all these stories have taken on legend status or urban legend status more than substantiated claims. But in the case of Hub Clark, the Canadian government has given some credence to the ghostly sightings at Waterfront Station by commemorating his legend in a postage stamp, and the Canadian Royal Mint issued a coin depicting the haunted brakeman in their Canada's most haunted coin collection. So, at least that's some validation. The story of Hub Clark is a pretty standard railroad ghost story. But if it's true, it's pretty freaking horrific. In 1928, he was working out on the tracks in the rain when he slipped and fell. He hit his head, knocking himself unconscious. With the rain coming down, causing low visibility, a passenger train ran over him, severing his head from his body. Like I said, if the tale is true, it's pretty horrific. If it's not, then it just adds another layer of mystery to the Waterfront Station, since people have reported seeing Hub Clark ever since. Some people catch just a glow of light on rainy nights, like a railroad lantern that's being swung by a man while he walks. The light travels along where the northern tracks used to be, and then it just fades away. But other people have sworn that they don't just see an unexplained light. They claim they can actually see that it's a lantern and the apparition carrying it, a man in a 1920s railroad uniform. However, they claim they can't see his face because the apparition ends at the neck. It doesn't have a head. But Hub Clark's story doesn't end there. The office building next door to the Waterfront Station, known as The Landing, was once a warehouse for gold mining supplies. Employees in the building, including the concierge, have seen their own apparition on rainy nights. Apparently one evening, when it was raining, a woman was inside the landing staring out one of the back windows at the water. She appeared to be crying, so the concierge approached her to see if she needed any assistance. As he got closer, her crying got louder and louder, to the point he felt frozen in place. Unable to step any further, her sobbing rose to an almost hysterical pitch until she just vanished. When the concierge broke free from whatever was holding him back and he made it to the spot where she had been standing, there was an unexplained puddle of water on the wooden floor. In fact, the puddle of water appearing in that very spot was such an issue that it permanently warped the floor. When plumbers and roofers were called in, no one could find any explanation. Since the windows where she was spotted at overlook what was once the northern tracks where Hub Clark lost his life, some people speculate that she just might be his grieving widow. So, in general, I really do like to have some sort of first-person accounts to back up haunted claims. I like names, I like interviews, I really like details. Now, I have no idea if these stories that people tell about the Waterfront Station are just urban legend, or if there are people out there who could back up some of the experiences they've had, but I gotta say, I could see this place being haunted. There were so many people coming in and out of that place. Like I said, good times, bad times, and you could see where some people would want to just hang around in the afterlife.
I agree. Although, one question I have is, why is there always ghosts in the freaking bathroom?
I don't know. That seems to be a trend.
And you know how often I have to use the bathroom. I use the bathroom at every single place we go into.
I know. You know every bathroom in the United States. Well, all the places that we've been to.
So, statistically...
And I imagine you probably even map them out on Google Maps.
Probably. I do not.
I bet you do. But, it's not that far away. And I got to say, it's one of those places I'd like to visit for myself and check things out.
Yeah, we'll put it on our famous bucket list that we mention all the time.
Yeah, we'll just, bring a sleeping bag or whatever and go stay at the Waterfront station.
Oh.
Overnight.
Well, they might kick us out at 1:30 when all the trains are done. But we'll fight. No, we won't.
We could just say, please, sir, I have nowhere else to go. I'm a lonely, weary traveler.
I need to be close to the bathroom.
Yeah, that might work. Well, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode, all you fellow wanderers.
I guess so.
Join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Minds Wander.
See you soon.